Okay, welcome everybody to Refugee Radio at the studio in Radio Reverb 97.2 FM and online www.refugeradio.org.uk. Today I have my co-presenter Ayah with me.
Hello everyone.
Hello Ayah, thanks for coming on and to help me out today. We've got a bit of a handful. We've got two special guests today. We have David Miliband and Peter Kyle. Well, thank you for coming on the show.
Very nice to be described as a handful, thank you.
Yeah.
We'd like to ask you a bit about the International Rescue Committee. Where does the IRC operate?
So the International Rescue Committee is the organisation that I'm the president of. We're headquartered in New York, which is why I'm living there at the moment. And the origins of the organisation are pretty interesting in that it was founded by Albert Einstein, who was a refugee in New York when Hitler came to power. We now operate in 40 countries around the world and 200 field sites or so. And we work in war zones, like in northeast Syria at the moment, in Afghanistan, in Somalia. We work in the safe parts of countries where there's conflict happening, where people are taking refuge. We work in refugee hosting countries like Jordan and Lebanon, like Kenya and Uganda, like Bangladesh, where the Rohingya fled to 18 months ago. And we also are the largest resettlement agency in the United States. So we've got 25 offices across the US. But President Trump's administration has reduced dramatically the number of refugees being allowed into the US. And so we're trying to take some of our US practice to some of the European countries that are working on the integration of refugees into local life. So, for example, I've just come from Germany, and we're now working with 1,000 teachers around Germany to use our American experience of integrating refugees into schools, refugee children into schools, to help them with the refugees who are being allowed to stay in Germany.
And what's the biggest difference in the nature of your work, depending on where you're operating?
Well, the biggest difference is obviously we are working across the arc of crisis, from places where there's active conflict to places that are relatively peaceful, but where the challenge is more economic rather than security. There are some common elements. Women and girls are at greater risk, both in war zones and when they're in places of relative safety. Levels of violence, early child marriage are high. There are common elements too with the duration of displacement now. The history of the refugee support system has been its presumed limited amount of time before you go home, and now less than 3% of the world's refugees go home every year. So actually issues like employment and education become much more important, yet the humanitarian sector isn't very good at living with that kind of reality. We're a large organisation now. We're an $800 million organisation. We've got 13,000 employees, 15,000 volunteers, or daily paid incentive workers around the world. But what we're finding is that the demand for our services is outstripping the capacity that we have to respond. So we're growing. We've more or less doubled in my time as the CEO, but the problems got bigger faster.
And when did the IRC start?
Sorry, it started by Einstein, Albert Einstein, in the 1930s. So the first mission that we ever did was to set up a safe house in Marseille. It was occupied by the Nazis at the time, and we issued fake passports to about 2,000 people, including the artist Marc Chagall, who was helped to escape from occupied France by, it was called the Emergency Rescue Committee then. So that was the origins, and we try and honour the Einstein heritage through the refugee resettlement work in the US, but in the last 20 years we've become a large international humanitarian organisation.
Fantastic. And why did you personally want to work for them?
The three reasons. I'll tell you what I said to the interview panel when I got the job 5 or 6 years ago. I said there were three reasons why I wanted to get the job. I wasn't trying to escape from Britain. The three reasons I said to them were, first, that I thought issues at the boundary of foreign policy and humanitarian policy. How do you get medical aid into Syria if the government doesn't want you to do it cross-border? How do you educate girls in Afghanistan? How do you tackle sexual violence in the Congo? Those issues, which are on the border of foreign policy and humanitarian policy, I thought were some of the biggest issues in global public policy. They were tough issues, and I like tackling tough issues. And with my time as Foreign Sec, I sort of seen it from the governmental end, and I want to see it from the NGO end. That linked to the second reason, which is that I felt IRC was a bit of a sleeping giant. I wouldn't guess that many of your listeners have heard of it. We shouldn't speak in acronyms. Even the International Rescue Committee, that many people would have heard of it. But it's this extraordinary heritage and really a great organisation, or a good organisation that we're trying to make great, and I felt I could bring something to it. And also, thirdly, my parents were both refugees. So my dad was a refugee from Belgium, my mum was a refugee from Poland. I know literally that if Britain had not admitted refugees in the 1940s and 1950s, I wouldn't be here today. So I thought there was a certain way in which leading this organisation would help me close a circle, if you like.
Yeah, I think the work that the International Rescue Committee does is absolutely fantastic. You couldn't we were saying earlier, if you made a map of the world and said, okay, these are the problems, this is where I want to go, and you're in all of the places that I would want to go, doing all of the things I would think about doing. And it's funny, the thing we get, sometimes we get grief at Refugee Radio, people say, well, I've never heard of you, as if it's our fault that they're not that well informed about what's happening. But I think at the same time, it's kind of like, well, I think it's kind of, we're just too busy doing the actual work to spend our time running around doing the publicity and doing all the glamour stuff. And I think maybe IRC is a bit like that. You're
actually just... point. Look, I'm here today in Brighton because I'm supporting my friend Peter Kyle, but he was a development worker. He was an aid worker, and he was, if you like, in the more stable, I guess, but poor parts of the world. And I think we've got a lot to learn from the development world, from people like him with his experience as a development worker, as an aid worker. Because if you think about the last 20 or 30 years in respect of development policy, it went from being marginal. Remember, development before the Labour government in 1997 was just part of the Foreign Office. It didn't have its own department. The aid spending was one of the first things that got cut. And what aid workers like Peter did, I think, really, in a really important way, was two things. First of all, they showed that aid could make a difference, because until then there was a permanent drumbeat, no, the money gets wasted. And they showed, actually, if you dedicate the money to those who are in extreme poverty, you can make a difference. Secondly, they weren't scared of ambitious goals. So people like him were leaders in the Jubilee 2000 campaign, in making sure that the Millennium Development Goals mean something. And I think in the, I don't like to say the refugee sector, but in the humanitarian sector that includes refugees and the internally displaced and people who are trafficked, sort of forced migration, we've got to learn from that. We've got to show that the aid makes a difference, and we've got to not be scared of sticking by our values and having big goals behind them.
What would you say is the hardest part of your job?
I think the hardest mountain that we've got to climb is that people think the problem's so big that we can't resolve it. Mm-hmm. So if you say that there are 29.5 million refugees and asylum seekers, there are 40 million internally displaced, that's 70 million people, that's 1 in every 105 people on the planet, you can think, oh my God, that's just absolutely insurmountable Mount Everest of a problem. And so the biggest problem I have is when people say to me, well, how much difference does my £10 make? How much difference does my $100 make? How much difference does my $1,000 make? How much, in some cases, how much difference does my $1 million make? And the truth is, I've got to say to them, well, it won't make any difference if you don't give it. And trying to show, and it's not that people are mean, it's that they wonder whether or not they can really make a dent in the problem. So I would say that's the biggest problem. The second biggest problem is that the humanitarian system is designed to provide a short-term fix. It's to give you food today so that you don't die today. It's to give you medical care today so you don't die today. But a lot of the problems are long-term. And we're trying to solve or address long-term problems with short-term money. And that's a real impediment to getting things done. That's why we won the MacArthur Foundation, which is American. I mean, it's different in America. They do things on a scale. So we're an $800 million organization. This MacArthur Foundation, they offered a $100 million prize to address a global problem. We won. I mean, we won it with the Sesame Workshop for a 5-year program to address trauma among kids who had seen the war in Syria. And whether they're inside Syria or refugees in Iraq or Jordan or Lebanon, we've got 5 years of funding to really recognise that it takes 5 years to help a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old or a 12-year-old overcome the trauma of seeing their house bombed, their family members dismembered, etc. And so you've got a real sense with that programme that you can make a difference. And I think that's the kind of thing we need to showcase. And it's the kind of thing, frankly, where we need the British government, which has historically been a leader in aid policy, to get back to the front of the queue.
It's interesting hearing you talk about that, because you're right. When I was an aid worker, it was mostly long-term work we were doing. So I started off in Eastern Europe in 1990, where we were deinstitutionalising the lives around young people, but always committing that we're going to be with these young people right the way through. And it's amazing of how many of those kids that I saw who were in the most appalling conditions in Romania, for example, in 1990, are now leading incredibly productive lives, socially and economically. On my birthday, I'll get all these messages from a whole raft of people I knew as kids in cots, living in really some of the most squalid, emotionally barren circumstances in the world. But there was this one instance where I started working in Albania in 1992, and then 5 or 6 years later, we knew that country incredibly well from the long-term work we were doing there. And then suddenly, in one of the towns that we were working in, 50,000 refugees arrived in one night because they'd been building up on the Kosovan border with Macedonia. Macedonia wouldn't admit them into Macedonia, and there was an enormous crisis of people being stuck in this no man's land. And then Macedonia one day put them all on buses, on trains, and then shipped them straight into Albania and pushed them into Albania. So suddenly, I got a window into the sort of crisis world. In a town where 50,000 people, a town where the population was 50,000, suddenly had a doubling of the population overnight. And being part of a small team, then experienced the kind of what happens in this situation where these enormous resources come thundering into town, but don't have the granular understanding of the communities and the people that were there. So that was the first time I was introduced into the sort of refugee crisis side of it, but came at it from a long-term development perspective rather than moving from sort of refugee crisis work into long-term development work. And I think this is what David's saying is precisely what needs to be happening and where the learning needs to be. It's also why it's so important for me that during a time of election, you can usually it's very big issues dominated by people at the very, very top of politics who will be talking about what the latest focus group has told them our country wants to be talking about. So when I have the opportunity of bringing David to our community down here in Brighton and Hove, being able to actually talk about these sorts of issues is a really important thing for me, even during an election time, because these are the sorts of issues that should be brought into elections, not just parked and brought out and discussed when we are in a time of crisis, because a time of crisis is often the very worst time for us to start making the preparations to understand and to start making sure that we are a community that can respond to these sorts of issues. Now, during an election, is a perfect time that we start to bring these issues into our public life.
And of course, long-term solutions aren't something that politics is normally great at, because you've got to be short-term focused, because you've got to do something now in the next 5 years and fix this emergency problem. Development's like that as well, isn't it? Of course, we've got the sort of Marshall Plan model that we're going to sweep in, disaster relief, and then go again. When you're talking about these camps earlier, where people are, you've got this, there's no throughput. People are coming to the camps and they're staying there. And in some cases, like in Burma, people are there for generations. And I love this, the Sesame, this is Sesame Street, right? So you've got Elmo and these other characters.
And we've got some new Arab characters.
And it's part of a long-term trauma investment in dealing with the trauma that these young children, people have been through in these countries, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's evidence-based, and it's a unique partnership. It's in-person plus digital support, new TV program, but the in-person provides the extra care for those who are most in greatest need. And of course, it's a moving target, because there are bits of Syria that we're currently able to access, then you can't access it. There are refugees fearing being pushed out of Lebanon. But it's an exciting program, and I think it's hopeful. The only thing, let me just finish on this. You're right that politics can be short-term, but it can do long-term things. So when we came into government in 1997, we created the Department for International Development in legislation, so it can't just be, a click of a finger abolished, and we put that the money had to be used to tackle extreme poverty. It couldn't just be recycled for other purposes. And so trying to build in, and that's, I think, part of the explanation why it's now a 20-year-old, 22-year-old department, and why there's a degree of solidity. So politics can be short-term, but the job is to try and do things that actually last long-term.
Not quite, yes. Yes, very good point. Finally, I have a question. Who is the most inspiring person you've met? This is to both of you. Presumably you've met lots of inspiring people.
What, ever?
Yeah, ever.
Who's the most inspiring person?
Is it Elmo from Sesame Street? Because
ever?
You can say if it is.
That is such a great question. That is such a great question. I would say that for me it would be Anita Roddick, co-founder of The Body Shop, simply because I met her when I was 18, and I'd just gone to work at the Body Shop, and I'd left school with no qualifications really. I was very frustrated. I wasn't an angry person, but I was very frustrated that I know that I hadn't succeeded, my potential wasn't being reached. I bumped into her because I was so useless at my job at the Body Shop, and I applied 8 times for a job there, didn't get it, so I went and sat in reception until somebody came out and met me, and then they gave me a job which was the lowest paid job in the company, in the accounts department. And I'm very acutely dyslexic. I'm very severely dyslexic. I didn't know it at the time. And I was so bad at my job, I loved the company so much, and I'd never met Anita, I'd just seen her from afar, that I used to go in on Sundays so that I could keep up to date with my work without anybody knowing. And she was the only other person that used to go in and work on a Sunday, and that's how we met. And since then, since that moment, she started to knock me into shape and really just, push me in a way that nobody ever had before. And she was the first person, when I got to the age of 25, said I should think about going to university. I then had to return to secondary school for a year as a 25-year-old to get the qualifications I needed to go to university. I then had to apply 3 times before university would have me. And she was always behind me, pushing me very hard and kept reinforcing that I had this thing. Now, that story I've described from her is repeated hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times by people that came across her, but also by people who never met her. Very interesting for me, seeing an interview with Jo Swinson a little while ago, and I saw the interview in her office, and there was an autobiography of Anita Roddick behind her on the bookshelf. So she, for me, is somebody who had a very direct connection with my life. I've got to say this very quickly, I once met Nelson Mandela, where I was in South Africa where I was doing my fieldwork for my doctorate on international development, and a local university professor said, if you stand there, he will walk past in 6 hours' time. So I stood on this spot for 6 hours because this guy knew the route he was going to take. And then his car pulled up, Nelson Mandela got out, he walked over to me, and I was so overwhelmed, I didn't move. And he held his hand out to shake my hand, and I didn't do it. Oh, I literally just stood there.
That's cold. I must have thought you really didn't approve of his efforts.
It's so nice to meet you, and he walked off, and I was just standing there.
Well, you've stolen my line, because I was going to say that probably the greatest person the greatest 20th century figure who I ever met was Mandela.
But you shook his hand as well.
I shook his hand. But I think that I always try to find heroes in ordinary people who do extraordinary things. And just because it's closer to mind, I was visiting our Ebola treatment centres in the Democratic Republic of Congo earlier this year, and we went to outside Goma, which is in the eastern DRC, and met a local group that we were supporting to become women leaders of their community. And the woman who is the secretary of this group, she said, I said, how much difference has the International Rescue Committee made to your life? She said, well, look, I didn't know rape was a crime until I met the International Rescue Committee, and now I'm the leader of my women's group. We've got 40 people in this group, and I am persuading every woman and every man who I can meet that we've got to rebuild our country from the bottom up, and if we want to end the civil war in DRC, in Democratic Republic of Congo, sometimes undemocratic Republic of Congo, we have to end the civil war in the home if we're going to end the civil war in the country. And I thought that was a very powerful thing. So not one answer, but certainly a powerful one.
Yeah, that's fantastic. The work on gender-based anti-violence programs internationally is probably one of the most perhaps innovative things that you do, and something that gets
0.12% of global humanitarian funding goes to gender-based violence. It's criminal. It's not tragedy. It's a crime.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Nice
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Ayah.
Really good luck.
Okay, thanks for coming in.